Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. I am Kushi Hang, and in today's episode, PEI colleague Pragati Karki is in conversation with Shabda Gyawali on Nepal's investment landscape, exploring bonds and beyond. Shabda is the investment director and a partner at Dolma Impact Fund, the largest private equity fund focused on Nepal. He leads the investment team at Dolma, overseeing deal origination, transaction execution, regulatory approvals, and post-investment management. He is actively involved in sectors such as healthcare, renewable energy, and technology. He holds a BA in economics from Colorado State University and an MBA in sustainable entrepreneurship from the same institution. Pragati and Shabda discuss Nepal's investment sector with a special focus on the market for bonds. They observe the dominance of equity-based investments and explore alternative FDI mechanisms and the potential for green bonds for financing renewable energy projects. Drawing from his own observations, Shabda shares insights on the restrictiveness of Nepal's bond market and Nepal's weak credibility in this scene. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Namaste, this is Pragati Karki.
Namaste, this is Shabda Gyawali.
Welcome to the show, Shabda. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive into our conversation. So Nepal's pool of investment, especially in energy sector, is heavily focused on equity, and the majority of these investment in hydropowers required a large amount of debt, that is 70 to 75%, and which are usually equity-based, which is by issuing shares and giving ownership to the investor, which doesn't seem ideal. So to begin with, based on your experience and observation, can you illustrate what the Nepali investment sector looks like, and what different type of fund does Nepal's investment sector constitute, and do you see a shift?
Sure. So, regardless if it's equity or debt, Nepal needs a lot of investments, right? If you look at the figures from last year, Nepal attracted 58 million FDI. If you look at the data from this year, the first 9 months, then so far, according to Central Bank, Nepal has attracted around $48 million. Whereas, the study says that just to meet the sustainable development goals, Nepal needs around $7 to $8 billion annually. So we need a lot of money, be it equity or be it debt. Having said that, what we have seen, especially from foreign investment, is we have seen projects that are 100% owned by foreign entities, having both equity and debt, but projects where there are local promoters, what we have seen is there is a mix of both equity and debt that is coming in.
So like you said, we need a lot of money for development here in Nepal. So what are some alternatives FDI mechanism that Nepal can explore to fund its projects?
If you look at Nepal, right? So Nepal is not a to-go destination for foreign investment. It's a relatively small country. We don't have strong economic fundamentals. So Nepal needs to bank on few things that Nepal has, right? One of the things that Nepal can tap into is climate finance. In climate finance, what I see is there a lot of money going into climate finance for climate change adaptation as well as mitigation. So Nepal can tap into that pool of money to invest in infrastructure projects as well as projects that will help Nepal to be more adaptable on climate finance. So we need to tap climate finance. So how do we tap climate finance? So that's another issue that we need to think about. So there are a lot of investment that are happening through green bonds. So green bonds could be one of the instrument, as well as there are other impact investing funds, investors, ESG investors that are willing to invest in countries like Nepal to help Nepal or any other developing country with climate finance and climate change.
So you talked about green bonds, and within the bond market, green finance is a growing concept that focuses on raising capital for projects with environmental benefits. Can you briefly touch upon what green bonds are and how can Nepal leverage the green bond market to finance renewable energy projects apart from hydro and solar?
So what are green bonds? So green bonds are financial instrument that is used or earmarked to invest in environmental friendly projects. So it's a debt instrument. It's similar to any other bond. It's a debt instrument that is raised where the money that is being raised would be invested in green projects. So when I say green projects, projects that are environmentally sustainable. And so your other question was, where can green bonds channelized to, apart from hydropower and solar? To start with, I've not seen from a private sector initiative that a green bond has been raised and been investing in, even in hydro or solar, right? So I think, if Nepal or Nepali private companies are able to raise green bonds, most probably it's going to go and be invested in hydropower projects or solar projects. I'll give you a rational why too, right? Green bonds, the investors who have invested in green bonds, at the end of the day, they are also investors. They might not be looking at very high returns, but they are looking at returns. So if you look at the renewable energy space here, or projects that are environmental friendly here, that has market track record is hydropower and slowly solar, right? So just to give you an example, if you invest in a hydropower company with a PPA with NEA, if the hydropower project is made, then NEA pays the bill for the energy that the hydropower company sells, and that the money that you get from NEA is used to pay back the investors, either through coupon or to pay the principal back. So I think we should start with hydro first. And once we have a clear track record, especially for the international investors, then we might be starting exploring other renewable energy, sectors.
So, like you said, bonds can definitely be a great alternative, especially for energy sector. They can be traded as green bonds and Nepal can tap into climate finance. But you also know that Nepal has a very restrictive market. So therefore, investors are a bit reluctant to consider Nepal as an investment destination. So why do you think investors don't find Nepal as a viable or a favorable investment destination?
Nepal, as I said earlier, Nepal is not a well-known investment destination, right? And I think why it's not a well-known destination is we have not marketed it enough. We need to go out there and market Nepal's potential, the projects that we have, the returns that you can get, and yes, sure, we can create a report or a marketing deck and then present it to the potential investor. But the biggest marketing tool Nepal will have is to have an existing foreign investor to show their track record. A foreign investor who have come in Nepal, have invested in green projects here, and the returns they have got, right? So that will be the biggest track record. Another thing that why Nepal has not been an attractive investment destination is that we need to do more of a economic diplomacy. We need to, our embassies around the world needs to be mobilized to help market out the projects, be it private sector projects or the government projects. What we also need to do is, we need to have investment summits, not in Kathmandu, but somewhere else. Probably it's Dubai, be it Delhi, or somewhere else. So that's where you will see more investors coming in. Third thing that we also need to do is probably leverage our NRN community. NRNs are the ambassadors for Nepal. What they tell to the potential investors will matter and weigh more than what we write in a report.
I think it's very interesting how you consider NRNs to be important stakeholders, and this got me thinking, who else can be key stakeholders involved in facilitating Nepal's entry into international bond market?
Sure. So earlier I skipped this introduction that Dolma Impact Fund or Dolma Fund Management is also trying to raise a green bond. We've been doing some early work and we have made some traction on green bonds. So we are trying to raise green bonds to help Nepali energy projects. We plan to list this green bond somewhere in Europe. We have not finalized the jurisdiction yet, but the work is going on. Just to answer your question, who are the key stakeholders involved if somebody's trying to raise a green bond, or, who are the key stakeholders in the international bond market? So talking from experience, there are a lot of stakeholders that are involved. So starting with institutional investors. So institutional investors means investors who are interested to buy that bond, the buyer of the bond. So you need to cater to investors who are actually wanting to invest in a bond, which the proceeds from the bond will go to finance or refinance energy projects in Nepal. So you need that international investor. The second thing you need is, you would need an investment banker. To raise a bond, you need regulatory approvals. You need to find the investors that you want. You need to pitch to them. So there are various things that investment bank will help you do it. So you would need an investment bank too. The third is, guarantee service providers, right? So what the investors are concerned about, even if they are willing to invest in green projects, is, what happens if NEAD falls? What happens if there's a payment delay, or payment is not possible if the government or the central bank decided not to allow to repatriate money. So you need like guarantee service provider, right? And to raise a bond in a country like Nepal, where there's no sovereign credit rating, the cost of capital is very high. So you need to find, concession capital somewhere to make sure that you reduce the cost of capital so that there will be some interest. Then if you're raising a bond, you need a bond certifier, credit rating agency, then you would need an approval from government of Nepal and central bank. So a lot of stakeholders involved.
Like you mentioned, Nepal needs a good credit rating for having the credibility to attract more investment, right? So there was an attempt made to obtain a credit rating back in 2019, before that year's investment summit, but Nepal failed to do so due to time constraint. Can you briefly touch upon the need for good credit rating while issuing bonds?
So what is a credit rating? So it's just like a person going for a job interview. So the first thing that when you apply for a job, the first thing that you send to a potential job is your CV. So credit rating is just like a CV. What has been your past experience? What are your skills, right? Where did you get your education? What was your track record? So these are the things that a potential employer will look at. So credit rating is just like that, right? So credit rating is a CV for a country that is trying to raise money from outside world. So why is it important to have a good credit rating? So when you have a good credit rating, what happens is your cost of capital goes down. So you'll have a lower cost of capital. So if you are planning to go raise a bond, then you have to pay less money, right, to raise that money. So it's just like interest. So your interest cost goes down in a basic, layman terms. Your interest goes down if you have good credit rating. The second thing is, if your CV is good, then there might be a chance you are called for the interview. So it's similar like that. The investor confidence goes up. Another thing is, when you have a good credit rating, then your access to credit. If Nepal has a bad credit rating, let's compare two countries. So let's say for now compare Bangladesh and Nepal. If Bangladesh has a better credit rating than Nepal, then there's a high possibility that somebody who just have a limited amount of money and is willing to invest in South Asia would probably invest in Bangladesh rather than Nepal. So it's important to have a good credit rating. I'll give you an example and I'll end this question. So if you look at the credit rating of our neighbors, India, so the benchmark that typically happens when you do a credit rating, so what is the cost of borrowing? So the 10-year government bond in India is around 7%. Whereas, you hear a lot about what has happened in Sri Lanka, and if you look at the 10-year government bond, the rate is 13%. So it's almost double. So that's why it's important to have a good credit rating.
So apart from credit rating, what can Nepal further work on to increase its credibility?
That's a very good question. I think, for Nepal to increase its credibility as a good destination for investment, I think few things needs to be done from a government level. Yeah, of course, there are things that the private sector is also has to do, but from a government level, one is ease of doing business. You hear a lot of news that it takes a lot of time and hassle to get your, FDI approval. Things have definitely improved. I can talk from my first-hand experience. When I started, so we have invested in around 16 companies. One of the company for the whole process to happen, it took us 13 months. And the last one, right before the investment summit, we got the approval within, 1.5 months. So things have improved a lot. Kudos to the people sitting in Department of Industry and NRB. But we need to improve a lot. It has to be the same day or next day, right? So one is ease of doing business. The second thing that I think, which is also very important, you hear a lot these days in international media, is around taxation. So what government of Nepal needs to do is have a clear tax policy that is predictable. So that you know when an investor is coming, they know how much tax they are going to get charged. Not retroactive tax or unclear tax, but you need to know how much the government is going to charge. So that's the second thing. We are also very poor at something called advance ruling. So advance ruling is if I'm unclear about tax, I go to the tax man and ask how much are you going to tax me. So we don't see a lot of advance ruling happening. So if that practice can be more frequent, people would know more and have more clarity around the taxes. There are two more things. One is Nepal has signed double taxation agreements with a lot of countries, right? So those double taxation agreements needs to be honored. And the last thing is, especially with investment in green projects, hydro projects or solar projects or any green projects, if you are NEA is the buyer of the energy. The lot of question gets asked around what happens if NEA fails. Will the government come back and rescue it? So these are the things that we need to work on to increase the credibility.
Like you talked about what government needs to do to attract more investment in Nepal, but what role does the private sector itself plays while attracting investment in Nepal?
Sure, yeah. So, Nepal's private sector is as competitive, as competent any other private sector in any other country. But we don't show it. We don't market it. And unfortunately, probably one of the reasons why the international community or the international investors don't know about Nepal's private sector, private companies is that Nepali companies or Nepali individuals are not allowed to invest abroad. So if I am a clothing manufacturing company in Nepal who wants to open branches in US, Europe, India, China, then the current law says you are not allowed to invest outside Nepal. So probably that needs to be opened up for private sector to show their strength or their weaknesses, how competitive we are. The second thing that the private sector needs to do is, we need to have our accounting, our corporate governance at par or even better compared to companies around South Asia, where you're getting money from the same usual suspect investors. The third important thing that has not been highlighted much in Nepal is environmental, social, and governance, right? So ESG is a big topic, big thing these days when you're trying to attract investment. So we need to, when I say we, means Nepali private sector, we need to up our game on environmental, social, and governance issues. Also the health and safety issues.
So those are some amazing insights, Shabda. Moving on, let's change gears and take a fireside approach to this issue and talk about the sustainability of these bonds. Starting with the basic cautionary aspect, currently Nepal's debt-GDP ratio stands at 43%, with external debt at 22% of the GDP, indicating a healthy status compared to the cautionary threshold of 50%. So my question is, given Nepal's current healthy debt-to-GDP ratio, what level of borrowing through bonds would be considered sustainable in the long run? And also, should we consider how Nepal's GDP significantly relies on remittance as we approach investors?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And if you look at the recent trend that we have seen in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, a few countries in Africa where there was IMF bailout and everything, debt to GDP ratio was above 70%, or some of the countries were even above 100%, right? Like you said, Nepal's debt to GDP ratio is around 42% or 41 or 42%. Out of that, 21% is foreign debt and rest is, local debt, if you like. Even in that foreign debt, a lot of the debt that are coming from is from, multilateral and bilateral agencies, our neighbors and big countries like US, Japan. So these are the debt providers. What Nepal has not done is, it has not issued any commercial dollar-denominated bond. So we are not in a, we are not Sri Lanka or Pakistan in terms of, like our debt to GDP ratio is too high. Having said that, we should not be taking money, be it private sector money or be it from bilaterals or multilaterals, in projects if it's not feasible. So one thing that is very important for the regulators, the private sector to be cautious about is that, if you are raising international bond that is probably denominated in dollars or even in rupees, then, the project has to be feasible. The project has to generate cash to pay off the debt. So that's where the focus should be. Debt in itself is not a bad thing, right? But you need to be cautious where you're taking the debt. We do have some policies in place where, we get policed by the central bank. If you're raising international debt, there are caps and ceilings that you cannot raise debt from international investors if your interest rate is more than this much or your tenure is less or more than X number of years. So, yeah.
So, borrowing in foreign currency comes with a lot of risk for Nepal, especially when it involves issuing bonds in foreign currency, as Nepali rupees is pegged with the Indian rupee. This means any change in the exchange rate can make it very risky for Nepal. So, my question is, how can Nepal make sure that it has enough foreign currency reserve to service its dollar-denominated debts, as there is a possibility for Nepalese currency to lose its value or depreciate?
So, you had other question earlier too that I forgot to answer is that, the role of remittances, right? If you look at Nepal's foreign exchange reserve, so right now I think it's around $14 billion. 2 years ago, when there was a panic, when the panic button was pressed, it was around less than 7%. And usually the central bankers would press the panic button if it's less than 7%, right? $14 billion for a, $45 billion economy, it's a good, a good amount of reserves. Be it remittances, be it foreign investment, or be it, domestic investment. The money needs to go to build sustainable projects, not just for consumption or projects that are not feasible at all, where, half-baked idea was developed into a big infrastructure projects. One is, be it remittances, money from remittances, or be it foreign investment, it has to be going into a feasible project that has a good project planning. Another thing that you usually see in infrastructure projects is, the cost overruns are because time delays. The time delays are due to not having a proper project plan. And during the construction, something also happens, right? If it's a debt, then there's something called interest during construction that needs to be capitalized. That also, it's significant. It's north of 10%. So that cost also adds up. So the point I'm trying to make here is, be it bond, be it remittances, or be it, how do you be less vulnerable regarding this too much foreign debt, is that we need to have a stronger project planning, feasibility study, engineering plan, design. So we need to make more investment around that, right? I don't think it will be a prudent idea not to, just because, with the fear that, Nepal is going to run out of foreign exchange reserves, that we should not be taking foreign debt. But, like I said earlier, it has to be, the project has to be really feasible, that earns its own cash to pay back. Another thing that is, there are products that are available these days that helps to lower the cost to mitigate the foreign exchange fluctuation. So there are institutions like TCX, which was founded by development financial institutions to help countries like Nepal, like developing countries, to ensure and encourage them to take foreign investment or foreign currency loan, and to see if the fluctuation, the foreign currency appreciation or depreciation, and the interest rate volatility can be mitigated. So there are some products that are available in the market that can be tapped by the private sector or the private projects. On a bigger scheme of things, there is something called Bridgetown Initiative. The whole idea about Bridgetown Initiative is, how can developing countries like Nepal tap into climate finance to fulfill its need? And one of the components of Bridgetown Initiative is to provide foreign exchange guarantees by, big multilateral like IMF or World Bank, so that, Nepal or countries like Nepal don't become too much vulnerable because of the foreign exchange fluctuation.
So, like you said, one of the approach to mitigate a risk of currency depreciation for borrowers is receiving exchange rate guarantee, and one of them are concessional exchange rate guarantee. So, how realistic is for Nepal to obtain concessional exchange rate guarantee, and from whom?
How realistic it is, I don't know. Jury is still out, and we are also trying. But there has been some examples in Nepal that has tapped into concessional finance. But we need to try, right? So we need to try, and the investors or the multilateral, bilaterals who can create and provide this product are aware of this kind of problem that country like Nepal or projects in country like Nepal face. So they are trying to create this product to cater to us. I would not be able to say how possible it is, but we should definitely try.
So, like you said earlier, whenever it comes to debt, there is a certain kind of alertness that the debt demands, especially in recent years. Like you gave example of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and some African nation, they are struggling to pay back the incurred amount. So, how can Nepal ensure that this increased access in this commercial debt doesn't lead to an unsustainable debt?
So probably I'll be biased, but for to tap into this kind of debt, it should start with energy project, especially hydropower. The reason why I say that is we have a market for that. With this agreement with India that India is going to buy 10,000 megawatts, let's assume that India actually buys it, which means there's a market. And when there's a market, then you also know that cash is coming. So Nepal should start a case study with the green bonds. With the proceed from the green bonds would actually be used to build projects, energy projects, because there's a assured market. So that should be the case study. Yeah, so that's number one. Another thing that Nepal has to ensure is, again, the feasibility aspect of it, right? It does not make sense to finance a project that is so big and cost heavy that it will not be feasible. So, the precision of the feasibility of the project, the design aspect of it, the project planning aspect of it, the project management aspect of it has to be very strong. And the third part is, every foreign investment or every foreign loan comes through the central bank, and central bank already have mechanism in place where a foreign investor cannot lend at a rate that is too high. They have already capped the rate.
So we talked about policies beforehand, like the double taxation policy, how Nepal has it, and like apart from these kind of policies, how can Nepal strategically attract more bonds, especially in green bonds, or what policies that Nepal needs to focus on to attract more green bonds?
Yeah, so to attract more green bonds, one thing that's very important is the ESG disclosure and ESG aspect of it. So there are a lot of ESG investors these days, right? So if you look at green bonds data, right now, 2023, the total amount of green bonds that was raised was around $500 billion. And by 2030, that $500 billion will go into $1 trillion, so which is CAGR of 10%. So much money, not just in green bonds, but at climate finance, in the climate finance side of it, right? But a lot of the investors that are willing to invest in Nepal would require a strong and stringent environmental, social, and governance disclosure. So let me explain that a little bit. If an investor who is interested to invest in Nepal through a green bond or directly through a climate fund, be it equity or debt, would look at a project or a potential project and see what are the environmental consequences that project will have. Even if the project will have an environmental consequence, then what are the mitigating factors? The second thing we look at is social issues, like livelihood restoration plan, resettlements. And the third thing that they will look at governance, right? So there are a lot of mandate that you'll get in ESG disclosures. We are not that strong in ESG disclosure. There are a few companies that have already started doing it, especially the companies which has either investment from private equity funds like Dolma or through development financial institution. But that disclosure, adapting to policies and adopting to those policies is very important. And another thing that needs to be done is it's still a foreign concept, ESG. So it has to be embedded in every companies in Nepal, like either through policies or policies and regulation, as well as through the financial institutions. So that is very important.
So, to the last questions, we only recently had the investment summit. So, what was your observation? And is the narrative shifting from equity-based investment, consider more diverse or strategic sourcing?
Yeah, so my view on the recent investment summit, it was a big event. I think 1,600 people attended it. One positive thing that I saw was the senior government official, politicians, private sector, they are very clear that, Nepal needs to attract investment. The same voice was heard in every panel. Where I think we could have done better is that, I believe that the investment summit should be done somewhere outside Nepal. It might just be my personal view, but where you can attract investors, where genuine, real investors will come in, where there is easy access to come in, like in a transit or, you have a easy flight routes. Could be Qatar, could be Singapore, could be Dubai, could be probably India too, right? So that's where the investment summit should be. What I saw or what I think was, a lot of focus was given to multilateral and, but the point I'm trying to make here is, it's good that they're getting the highlight, but the whole idea about investment summit is to attract investment, real commercial investments. So Nepal needs to graduate from getting investment from development financial institutions. So that's, I think, the next investment summit, we should focus on attracting the real commercial investors.
So we have reached the end of this discussion. Is there anything you would like to add before we part? Any thoughts?
So I've been investing in Nepal since last 12 years. There are challenges, but there are opportunities too. And things takes time in Nepal, but it eventually gets done. In terms of attracting investment, be it climate finance or be it, just finance, is that, we need to have a deadline approach. The whole idea about why Nepal does not get any, too many investment or too much investment is that we are slow at things. So we need to expedite. So if we can have a better deadline approach, time-bound project planning, then I think we'll do a good job in attracting investment. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Shabda, for joining us and sharing your time, knowledge, and experience.
Thank you so much for having
me. Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Pragati's conversation with Shabda on Nepal's investment landscape, exploring bonds and beyond. Today's episode was produced by me, Khushi Hang, with support from Nirjan Rai and Ritesh Sapkota. The episode was recorded at PI Studio and was edited by Ritesh Sapkota. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's TWEET followed by the number 2 and PEI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Khushi. We will see you soon in our next episode.